Hey guys, welcome back for today's lecture on May 5th. Happy Cinco de Mayo. Yeah, yeah, Cinco's 5. Okay, had to think that one through. Um, so yesterday we talked about the space race and the Apollo missions. Um, then we got into Nixon and his visit to China and OPEC and the Yom Kippur War. So continuing with Nixon today, we're going to get into his Vietnamization plan. Vietnamization was his plan to eventually withdraw the U.S. from the Vietnam War. And so its purpose is to expand, equip, and train the South Vietnamese. They weren't giving up on the war, or they weren't giving up on the fight. They were just taking themselves out of the battle. So they wanted South Vietnam to still stand, but they were in no shape to do so on their own. So they had to train them and grow them, recruit and then equip them properly. And then slowly we would just kind of phase ourselves out. We would start sending troops back home in small numbers, and then within a few years we would be out completely. And this would not only benefit America, and that people were clamoring for the troops to come home and stop fighting a needless war, but he believed that it would establish peace with honor, meaning that if a stalemate ensues and they decide to stop fighting, then South Vietnam could take pride in the fact that they were able to stand on their own and they didn't just need, American help or America to fight for them. Um, so the U.S. before getting completely actually before Nixon even steps into office, we'd been chasing the Viet Cong for quite some time in Vietnam. Now remember, the Viet Cong is the rebel guerrilla fighters of North Vietnam. And the Viet Cong was very elusive because they had a very complex system of tunnels and trenches, and they operated through the jungle, which was very difficult to keep tabs on them and pursue. Like, you couldn't just fly a plane over the top and see all their movements. Like, the trees covered basically everything. So we'd gotten reports that the Viet Cong was also working in Cambodia, which neighbors Vietnam to the west. Uh, So the U.S. began bombing raids on Cambodia. And here's a fun fact. Cambodia had more bombs dropped on them than any other country in any other war ever. Earlier this chapter, I said that North Korea had more bombs dropped on them than anybody up to that point, and that was true. Cambodia had more bombs dropped on them than North Korea did. And these were carpet bombs. I mean, they're just peppering the jungles of Cambodia. And we're not even at war with Cambodia. We're not even at war with Vietnam. But Cambodia is even less involved. So what does that do? Well, it cripples Cambodia and it drives them into the arms of communism themselves. And in steps a group called the Khmer Rouge and a leader known as Pol Pot, if you remember me talking about him last year, maybe the most evil human being who's ever lived, and he massacred his own people. But that was a direct result of American carpet bombs on Cambodia. Just because there were a few divisions of the Viet Cong possibly hiding in Cambodia. So, seemingly a little unnecessary, you could say. Now, an even worse turn of fate is the My Lai massacre in 1968. Um, this was a massacre that U.S. troops committed against innocent women and children, really all civilians, but you know, the fact that it includes women and children is the worst part, of South Vietnam. They'd also heard reports that the Viet Cong was littered throughout South Vietnam and they were recruiting people. And so American troops didn't know who to trust and who to believe. So they go through a town known as My Lai and they massacre just about everybody in sight. You know, women and children that were praying at church, troops go in, execute them, rape and murder. It was indiscriminate. They killed anybody in sight in that village. Hundreds were taken out. They would, you know, cars would be pulled over to the side of the road and the people in the vehicles would be killed. There are some pretty horrific images of the massacre taken. And at that point, a lot of it just had to do with the fact that even the American troops were just disillusioned with being at war. You know, they were just sick of it all, and they didn't feel really any sympathy for the civilians. So they kept saying their defense was, well, they thought that these women and children were working for the Viet Cong, and they thought they had hand grenades, and so they felt threatened. It's, to my knowledge, the most disgusting and horrific thing American soldiers have ever done. And we've had our fair share of, you know, terrible actions, but this was up there, and it gets released to the public, and it's just further, you know, further incentive for us to get out of Vietnam. You know, there was a few decent and brave soldiers who went against orders and helped the civilians. A couple helicopter pilots. One of them, I think his name is Hugh Thompson, went against orders and flew his helicopter into the village to try and save survivors and airlift them to safety. He even threatened to open fire against fellow American troops to ensure their safety. And he was originally like blacklisted from the military after that. They thought of him as a whistleblower. They thought he was ratting out the military, and he made a lot of enemies when he disclosed that information. But over time, we got more reasonable, and he was given a handful of medals and awards, but he never accepted any of them because he still felt so disgusted from the entire ordeal. Then we get the Pentagon Papers, which Pentagon Papers were leaked government documents that included American plans for the Vietnam War and their actions that maybe weren't common knowledge at the time. And they were leaked on the front page of the New York Times in 1971. So there was the actions in Vietnam and the plans of Vietnam had been being recorded by kind of a government paid historian. Like all this was possible because everything was being recorded and a historian was making note of everything going on, and that information was meant to be classified. But it got leaked and ends up on the front page of the paper, and some of the things that it involved or that it mentioned. First of all, was the plan. As the Vietnam War went along, we realized it was going to be near impossible to win. So uh, our plan shifted to avoid defeat and just ensure the containment of communism. Uh, the plans for the Vietnam War were set as far back as their mid 50s, back when France was kicked out originally of French Indochina. And from the beginning of the Vietnam War, President Lyndon Johnson had always said that the whole reason for involving ourselves in the Vietnam War was to help a friend in South Vietnam. We thought that was a moral thing to do, and we thought it was a valiant thing to do. But in the Pentagon Papers, it was reported that that wasn't the plan at all, or that wasn't the reason for America's involvement. The reason was to contain China, because we saw China as a major threat, and we wanted to limit their imperialism that we thought they were on the path of. You know, Lyndon Johnson, JFK and Johnson both considered China a possible imperialist country, much like Japan and Germany in World War II when they grew to power. So this all just further angers the citizens, and it's just another nudge to the government to, hey, get the heck out of Vietnam. You have failed epically in every way. And then this leads to a Supreme Court case, New York Times versus the U.S. The leak specifically was threatened to be charged with the releasing of classified documents, and I don't think it was espionage, but it was some other massive charge. And the Supreme Court sided with the New York Times and said it's freedom of speech, it's freedom of press. You know, these documents were not properly classified and kept safe, so to get into the hands of the public, and the public has the right to know what the government's true intentions are. So no further action was taken against the leak, and it damages the legacies of JFK and Johnson a little bit, at least. Not so much nowadays, but at the time, it dimmed their light a bit. It doesn't really do anything to Nixon, because Nixon wasn't involved in this. He'd only been president for about a year and a half when this is released. So there's nothing really damning about him in there. But it's still not a good look for the president of the United States to have to deal with a leak like this, even if it's not at your expense. 1973, the War Powers Act is passed, and that is a direct counter to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. If you remember, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave the president the power to send troops into conflict without a declaration of war. Well, since that seemingly worked out so well, sarcasm noted, that they decided we better be able to control this and make sure something like this doesn't happen again. So the War Powers Act doesn't take away the president's right to do so, but it requires 48 hours advance notice to Congress, so that Congress can formulate a plan on how to either proceed or how to possibly put a stop to it. And then it also limits the deployment of troops for 60 days. No more than 60 days can troops be deployed without congressional consent. And then on top of that, another 30 days to finish with the withdrawal of soldiers. And that's still enacted today. That's still holds up to this very day. And then the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, when the U.S. finally decides to get the heck out, they meet a meeting in Paris between Ho Chi Minh, which was the head of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was the name of North Vietnam, and the leader of South Vietnam, his last name's Diem, or no, not Diem, his successor. I don't remember what his name was. Oh, that was another thing in the Pentagon Papers. We mentioned how we initially put in power the first president of South Vietnam, which was no secret, everyone knew that. But then the president of South Vietnam in, oh gosh, I don't know what year, before 1971, obviously, he was assassinated. He was overthrown by his own people and replaced. Well, in the Pentagon Papers, we mentioned that we were the ones that ordered that assassination. So we ordered the assassination of a person we put in power ourselves, showing ultimate buyer's remorse. So anyway, sorry, I forgot to mention that. That was another thing that we weren't happy about. But at Paris, those two countries' leaders and Nixon all meet, and we come up with a plan: stay divided, stay out of each other's hair. The United States is getting the heck out of here. And so they sign a ceasefire. This is like a truce. It's not a treaty. There haven't been rules and stuff established yet. It's just a ceasefire until a treaty can be written. And that ceasefire was in effect for less than a day before North Vietnam and South Vietnam continued fighting each other. Now we move on to President Gerald Ford and détente. If I was still able to have President's Day, we'd talk about why Ford takes over randomly in 1974. Well, it's because President Nixon got involved in a huge scandal and was forced to resign. He was about to become the only president to be forcibly removed from office. He was impeached. He was the second president to be impeached, and he was going to be the first one found guilty and forced out of office. But he decided to kind of save face and just voluntarily step down. And so his vice president, Gerald Ford, steps in and finishes the term. And here we have the Helsinki Accords, which Helsinki is in Finland. It was a meeting with the U.S. and really almost all of Europe, and including Eastern Europe, as well as the Soviet Union, talking about how they can ease Cold War tensions and how they can ease tension in Eastern Europe, because it was starting to brew. Eastern Europeans were getting a little tired of the failures of communism and the oppressive rule of the Soviet Union. So the U.S. meets with all those countries and they come to some agreements. It's really not a big event. Nothing really changes, but it's one of the first establishments of Ford's foreign policy. And a further change in the SALT Treaty, the first one, the Soviets accused the U.S. of possibly violating it in the mid-70s, proved not to be true, but there were some amendments made. Oh my goodness. There were some amendments made to the treaty. Nothing major, but and then we have the fall of Saigon. Saigon was the capital city of South Vietnam, most important strategic city, and the U.S. was in the process of evacuating all the people there. Now, they've evacuated almost all the soldiers. There were still diplomats and government employees that were still in Vietnam. On April 29th, North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong launched an invasion into South Vietnam, and they reached Saigon. And that picture there at the bottom is a picture of Operation Frequent Wind, which was an emergency exit for all the American and endangered South Vietnamese citizens. On that day, through helicopter, 7,000 people were airlifted out of Saigon and airlifted out of Vietnam altogether. We even took South Vietnamese civilians that did not want to be in communist rule, at least that were in Saigon. So, yeah, 7,000 people through, I don't know how many helicopter, but they're all done through helicopter. I don't know if you've seen a helicopter. They're not terribly big. I couldn't even guess as to how many people you could fit in there. I would think minus pilot, co-pilot, you could probably squeeze no more than 15 or 20 in a helicopter. That'd be purely a guess, though. I could be dead wrong. And so 7,000 in less than 2 days. It's a lot of helicopter flights while war is going on below you, while the North Vietnamese are moving into the city. Saigon falls, and they rename the city of Saigon Ho Chi Minh City. And I think today it is still the most populated city in Vietnam. But that ultimately unifies Vietnam. Today, Vietnam is a unified country. There's no North and South. It's just one Vietnam, and they are still under a communist government. So that is the result of that. So those thousands of American soldiers' lives that were lost, the South Vietnamese civilians' lives that were lost, both due to American troops and North Vietnamese troops, was basically all for naught because South Vietnam ends up becoming communist anyways. So for some reason, American revisionists like to claim we're undefeated in warfare, and it's not true at all. Some argue we lost the War of 1812. I'm not one of those. The War of 1812, we didn't win. It was more of a stalemate, and the British just got tired of fighting, so things went back to the way they were before. But I wouldn't say we won the Korean War. I think that was another stalemate. But we for sure lost Vietnam. And the only way you could say we haven't lost a war is if you tried to make the case that Vietnam wasn't a war because we never declared. But I think that's a cheap way out. It was a conflict that we got full-fledged involved in, and we failed. Our initiative was to keep Vietnam from being communist, and what was the result of the Vietnam War? Vietnam unifies as a communist country. Failed objective. Lost war. And I'm not trashing on the U.S. I mean, we have a pretty decent record as far as conflict goes, but that is not one of our prouder moments. Our prouder moments include our rebound from Pearl Harbor and our victory in World Wars I and II, but this is not one of them. So that takes us to the question: what were the Pentagon Papers? Simple enough. I think you guys can handle it. I did talk quite a bit, and I apologize, but that was something I really wanted to get covered. We're going to finish this week one way or the other. I'm going to get through it, and then we'll still have a Zoom meeting on Thursday, and I'll clear everything up then, and we'll be good to go. So if you guys have any further questions, please reach out, and I will see you or talk to you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.